Hi, my name is Nicole Gugliotti. I'm the studio technician for the art department, and I'm going to introduce you to the ceramic studio. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where to find things and how to take care of the studio this quarter. So once you get into the classroom, I want you to take a look around. You'll want to keep the classroom this clean or cleaner all quarter long. So in the ceramic studio, we want to keep the dust down to a minimum. That's because silica, if it builds up in the room and you breathe it in, can actually be dangerous. A lot of those silica particles are so small that once you breathe them in, the parts of your lungs that are supposed to push things out can't push them out. And so a best practice in the studio is to keep dust down to a minimum. We do that by wiping everything down with a wet sponge, clean that sponge between wipes, and we also sweep and mop in a special way, which I'm going to demonstrate for you now. All right, so you might be familiar with this type of broom from home. In the ceramic studio, we don't really use it, and we definitely don't want to use this sort of typical sweeping motion because we're going to push all those tiny particles that we don't want to breathe in into the air. Instead, we're going to use a different type of broom, either a wide broom or a dust mop. And you can find these brooms in the back next to the sink in the area labeled brooms. We're going to use this dust mop, and what we'll do is systematically start in one area and move all of the dust into another area. You can just turn and keep sweeping until you've swept all of your dust into one area. Then you can take this broom and carefully push all of that debris into the dustbin. Everything from the dustbin will then carefully go into the trash. All right, now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about mopping. Now, if you've been assigned the duty of mopping, you're going to want to coordinate with your classmates and make sure the room has been swept before you start mopping, or we're going to have a mud bath on our hands. All right, you'll find the mop of the mop bucket in the back of the room by the sink in the area labeled mops. And this is pretty basic stuff. You're going to want to get your mop wet, squeeze it out, and start mopping. Our main goal when we're mopping this room is really to get the dust and the dirt off of the floor and into the bucket. So you're going to want to go just a few feet and then rinse your mop again. While you're sweeping, you might find some bits of clay have been smushed on the ground. That's pretty normal. Just grab a scraper, scrape that clay up. You can also use the small broom to get under and between the wheels if necessary, but just make sure not to kick up any dust. All right, so after you've been working, you might have some clay that's either too hard or too soft to go back in your bag of clay. Now, clay is a precious material. I recommend keeping as much of it as you can, but if you've got clay that's too hard or too soft to work, you're going to want to place it in one of our scrap buckets. Now, these scrap buckets, you can just put the clay right in. If you've got a throwing bucket that has a lot of slippy clay in there, just reach in there and get any big chunks out. Make sure those go into the scrap buckets before you go anywhere near the sink. Now, if you open the scrap bucket and it's super full, don't go ahead and pile things on there. Just use another scrap bucket, and if they're all full, then go ahead and check in with your teacher or the technician. All right, so you'll probably buy clay at the bookstore. We've got two kinds. We've got one that fires white and one that fires kind of a brownish color. All of that clay that doesn't get used will be lovingly pugged into fresh, usable clay by me or our work study. And that clay can be found in this big gray bin. Sometimes there'll be a yellow bin with clay and it'll be labeled. Go ahead and use that first. When you use the pugged clay, it's free. You can use as much as you want. It's usually covered by a moist towel and encased in plastic. You can go ahead and grab a log or a few logs, use it. Make sure you put your unusable clay in the correct place, the scrap bucket. If you've got great usable clay, wedge it together and put it back in here. Make sure you close up the plastic, replace the moist towel, and put that lid on tight. It's going to ensure that it's ready for the next person to use. You don't want to put too dry or too wet clay into the bin with the freshly pugged clay because that will make a mess and make it harder to use the clay that's meant for use. And also, you don't want to put anything that's already been fired or has colored slip or glaze into the reclaim. If you have any question at all, you can always err on the side of caution and you can put it right into the trash. If it's large or heavy, there's a dumpster right out back and you can use that as well. Again, if you have any questions, check in with your teacher or the technician. All right, so in the ceramic studio, we don't want any clay to go down the drain. So when you come over to the sinks, you'll see these sink buckets, and you're gonna wanna rinse all of your dirty tools in those sink buckets. Make sure you don't leave any tools in there because I or the work study might find them and it could be dangerous. So once you've rinsed your tools and they're nice and clean for the next user, you'll put them away. And your bucket that you might have been using for building or for wheel throwing, you'll have already taken the big chunks out, and then any of that slippy water can go right into these sink buckets, all right? Those will settle and we'll take care of them later. If your task that was assigned to you is cleaning the sinks, you don't have to worry about anything inside the buckets, just worry about everything outside of the buckets. All right, now I'm gonna talk to you about where to put things. Now, it's important to put things in the right place because if they're in the wrong place, they might get fired too soon or fired in the wrong firing. So you'll want to make sure you read the signs. Everything is labeled. And again, if you have any questions, ask your teacher or technician. This shelf right here is for works in progress. So if it's not done yet, you're still working on it, you want to keep it on this shelf. And there are boards and plastic so you can transport your object and keep it from drying out. But you want to make sure you use the appropriately sized board. So a big board and a small project takes up a lot of room, and with so many classes happening in this classroom, we need as much room as possible. So try to choose a board that's the correct size for your project. If you're worried about it drying out or it's something that you need to dry slowly, we also have this area, which is encased in plastic. We call it the wet box, and you can also place works in progress there. All right, so when your piece is all done and it's ready to go in the kiln, you're going to place it here on the greenware ready to be fired shelf. Now on this shelf, we don't want to use any boards because they take up room and this is some hot real estate once the quarter gets going. So no boards, go ahead and place your item directly on the shelf, and you'll want to place it on a shelf that's appropriate. And even placing it back a little bit is helpful. That way it cuts down on people having to move your stuff. This shelf right here is reserved for tall things, so try to put your taller things here and leave room for tall things if you've got smaller things. Okay, so you think your work is ready to go in the kiln. Let's just check and make sure. First of all, make sure your full name is on your pot. When you make that first pinch pot, you think you're never going to forget it. But when they come out of the kiln, they all look very similar. So having written your full name and have it very easy to identify, it's very helpful. Next, any closed forms, say if you put two pinch pots together, any form where there's air trapped should have a hole to let steam escape. Okay. Next on the list is nothing should be more than 3/4 of an inch thick. Now that's pretty thick, but beyond that it's going to be a little bit hard to fire. Wheel forms should be well trimmed and finished. If they're not, they're going to get kicked back. And if you've used paper inside of a form to hold its shape, that paper should have been removed before it goes to be fired. And lastly, all work should be well finished and not broken. So if your work hits any of those, it's going to be kicked back and you'll be able to chat with your teacher about how to proceed. All right, so if your work is broken, too thick, hollow with no hole for steam to escape, has not been trimmed, or is on the wrong shelf, it won't be fired. And it will get kicked to what we affectionately call the reject shelf. And that's this red area and really just this general area over here. So when you come to class, check the reject shelf, see if anything has made it to it. If it has, go ahead and fix the problem. Discard it if you've decided to make it again. And in general, speak with your professor about how to proceed. All right, once your work has been bisque fired, it's going to live on this shelf, this area here, bisqueware. And while it's in progress, while you're glazing it, before it's ready to go into the glaze kiln, it's going to live here. So once your work is glazed and ready to go into the glaze fire, you're going to place it on this shelf right here. Ready to be glaze fired means that the glaze isn't too thick, it's been wiped off of the bottom. If you've waxed the bottom, any beads have been wiped off, and then that gets placed here. That will go into the kiln. be fired, and when it comes out, it's going to go onto this shelf right here, and that's the exciting part. You get to see the finished product. This shelf also has a reject area, so work that has glaze on the bottom or is on the wrong shelf won't be fired, and that work will be placed on the side of the shelf with a note on it under the reject sign. And again, you can fix the problem, discard the item, or talk to your professor or the technician about how to proceed. Once your work is glaze fired, which is the last step, it'll be on this shelf, and you'll be able to take it and put it in your locker until your critique. So we talked a little bit about where things go. And I'd like to reiterate how important it is to make sure you put your pots in the right spot. The worst thing that could happen is something that's meant for one firing could go into another firing and it could blow up. Now in a glaze firing, basically glaze turns into molten lava and gets very sticky. So your blown up pot could stick to a bunch of other people's pots, and you know, it would be fine, it happens, but we want to avoid that at all costs. So don't worry, you're going to do great. Right, welcome to the glaze room. Now, your professor is going to walk you through this room later when you start glazing, but I just want to talk to you about cleanup in this room, because anything that originates in this room needs to be cleaned up in this room. And that's because there's a lot of colorful things in this room, and while clay is non-toxic, some of these colorful things we use, while they probably won't harm us as humans, we don't want them to go down the drain. So we use a 1, 2, 3 system in this room. And again, anything that originates in this room should be cleaned using this system. So even though you're welcome to take some stuff out into the classroom and use it there, when you're done, bring it back in here and clean it up using the 1, 2, 3 system. So number 1, you're going to do your first rinse here of anything with glaze, slip, or stain material on it. So you're going to rinse it in this big bucket here. 2, you're going to come to the sink, and like the sinks outside, we've got a sink bucket. You're going to rinse in there. And finally, you can rinse under running water. That'll just ensure that the bulk of those particles that we don't want going down the drain stay in the buckets, and then we bring those to hazardous waste facility. Again, don't be scared. Most of these materials aren't going to harm you. We just don't want them going down the drain. That said, you don't want to take a bath in any of these rinse buckets. While these glazes have delicious sounding names like eggplant, ketchup, cinnamon sensation, and nutmeg, you don't actually want to eat them. We do not allow eating or drinking in the glaze room. Because these are designated waste areas, we want to make sure that the lids are on these buckets when they're not in use.